Welcome to Accommodate This. My name is David, and I'm a late diagnosed autistic adult. I was terminated from my job in 2023 after reporting workplace misconduct and abuses from members of my team. Despite making every effort to communicate openly and honestly, I rarely received the same respect in return. My leaders seemed convinced that they knew my heart and mind better than I did. I begged for understanding and attempted to counter the lies and rumors about me, but they had already committed to the idea that I was unworthy of equal recognition on the team. And this treatment is a pattern of discrimination faced by many of us in the neurodivergent community. Many of us spend our lives feeling unwelcomed, unloved, and misunderstood. Our words are often overlooked in favor of our tone, which may have nothing to do with our message. And because of this, it's common for us to suffer alone or in silence, resulting in stressors that have real effects on our quality of life. Something needs to change, so I've decided to use my own voice to shed light on these abuses, because these experiences are far too common in today's world. While this pattern of abuse is not representative of everyone in the neurominority, it is undeniably a factor in the statistic that 85% of autistics are underemployed or unemployed, and that we are 7 to 9 times more likely to commit suicide. And now that you know why we're here, let's get into the topic for this video: mind reading. This is not going to be another video on theory of mind or the double empathy problem. I will touch on those concepts to a small degree, but maybe I'll cover those topics in greater detail in another video. For now, there are plenty of other YouTubers, both neurodivergent and neurotypical, who are covering those topics quite well. So I encourage you to go and look at those videos. Today, I'd rather talk about why we depend on models like theory of mind at all. First, let's talk about a word you may not have heard before: heuristics. Heuristics are mental shortcuts that help people make quick decisions. Think of them as rules of thumb, or models that help people solve problems quickly based on past experience. Heuristics are commonly used to simplify problems and avoid cognitive overload. In fact, they're part of how the human brain evolved and is wired, allowing individuals to quickly reach satisfactory conclusions or solutions to complex problems. Though these solutions may not always be optimal, they're often sufficient enough given limited timeframes and calculative capacity. Some would say they are satisficing. Cute word. The point is, heuristics can quickly get you close enough to a solution part of the time, but are not 100% reliable in getting to the right solution all the time, especially when the problems may require more research or analysis. Yet the temptation to rely on heuristic models is a challenge for many people, especially when there's a sense of urgency. We build these heuristics or shortcuts, models, or whatever you want to call them, over a lifetime of trial and error, or based on experiences both lived and perceived. But any map maker will tell you even the most detailed of maps is still not the same as the place they describe. Any architect will tell you that the best blueprint is still not the same as the final structure. The supermodel is not an example of the majority, but is unusual by definition. Similarly, heuristics are not always reliable models by which we can measure reality, especially ones that don't account for variables such as sensory sensitivities or neurological differences. Those of us in the neurominority account for about 15 to 25% of the population. So models based on mental patterns of the majority are at most 75% effective at getting even close to a solution. Autism especially, we only account for 1 to 3% of the population, making those same models practically useless. We just simply don't experience the world the same as neurotypicals. And you might be saying, well, how can that be? What do you mean you don't experience the world the same? If you cut us, do we not bleed? Yes, but When I say we experience the world differently, I mean we have different thought patterns and sensory experiences because our brains developed differently. While many of us could identify the color blue, who's to say that your experience of a particular shade of blue is the same as my experience of that same color? Each human brain contains trillions of neurons or brain cells, and they're connected in a variety of configurations. Each pathway allows for signals to be sent from one part of the brain to another across a chain of cells. Now consider the fact that each neuron can potentially connect to 100 other neurons, creating a web unique to each individual. The likelihood that any one of us has the same neurons connected in the same way is slim to none. Then considering that neurodivergent brains develop differently than neurotypical brains, the possibility for variation becomes astronomical. One path that leads to laughing in one person may lead to crying in another. Some people have been known to hear colors. Those with dyslexia switch the placement of written characters. Some people are more comfortable writing with their left hand than their right hand. And some people experience seizures that short circuit multiple brain functions at the same time. The collection of the pathways that are in our own minds ultimately define who we are and our uniquenesses. And sure, because we're part of the same species, we're able to generalize some of the similarities just well enough that it's close enough to handle the majority of situations. But again, those models are still only approximations that exclude people in the minority. When enough differences pile up to warrant a neurodivergent diagnosis, the differences can be significant enough to render some models basically useless. These differences can be difficult to notice on the surface because our brains are hidden beneath layers of flesh and bone, and emotions can be difficult to read unless expressed in a way that is understood. The differences in our neurology only tend to become apparent when we attempt to connect with one another, and we usually do that through communication. But the way our brains are built also impacts when, how, and why we communicate and to whom, and it limits our capacity to adapt to different communication styles. Executive functions include planning, problem solving, self-control, attention, and working memory, and these are all essential for effective communication. Many people in the neurodivergent community struggle with these things. Most autistics struggle with sleep issues, digestive problems, recognizing when we're hungry, thirsty, or need to use the restroom. And even identifying emotions and other sensations in our bodies is difficult because the pathways in our brains are different from the pathways in neurotypical brains. The messages sent around our brains take detours that neurotypicals don't have to worry about. Autistic individuals and those with ADD or ADHD may struggle with executive function, leading to difficulties with multitasking and focusing on multiple demands. Sure, we may also experience hyperfocus, which is kind of cool. It's the ability to intensely focus on a single task. But that ability can be both a strength and a challenge for us. And yet, because we are in the minority, we are expected to interact and behave the same as the majority who are privileged to live life in ways that come naturally to them. We in the minority struggle to anticipate the needs of the neurotypical community because the rules don't often make sense to us, and that's because they weren't designed for us in the first place. Attempting to conform can be exhausting because it takes great concentration to overcome the limitations of our neurology, and that further hinders our executive functioning abilities. These issues don't just overlap, they stack and build upon one another until it becomes more than we can handle. I am autistic, and like many autistics, I prefer direct communication. I don't know if the reasons for this preference are the same for all autistics, so I'm going to be speaking from personal experience. I don't want to make guesses about what another person is trying to tell me. I think it's dishonest and unfair to make assumptions and leap to conclusions, no matter how short those leaps may be. I lose sleep thinking about the myriad of ways a statement could be interpreted and stress over the many negative possibilities. I don't want others to feel the harsh judgments I've been subjected to my whole life, so I reserve judgment and ask questions to ensure I understand. But in my experience, most neurotypicals prefer to rely on their existing models rather than creating new ones. And that makes sense when you think about the fact that their models cover the majority quite well. The issue really only comes into play for them when they're conversing with someone of a different neurotype, because their neurotypical models don't often work for the neurominority. During my autism assessment, which was an 8-hour study, meticulously taking all kinds of measurements, the assessor concluded that I'm actually better than most people at grasping concepts and understanding what is being communicated in basic daily discourse. However, I still struggle to say with confidence that I know what someone is trying to tell me. I may grasp what they've said, but that doesn't mean I can read their mind. I prefer to know that when I process what is being communicated to me and try to make sense of it in my mind, that I'm not distorting the intended meaning. So while my best guess may be accurate enough most of the time, I lack the confidence to say I have a complete understanding all the time unless I check my assumptions. I naturally resist concluding that I know what the other person is saying until I've confirmed it with that person. To say I know before then is to claim that I can read the other person's mind, and I can't. I don't hold to any illusions that I may be infallible, or that there could not be another explanation for why a person is communicating in the manner they are. I could assume a person's tone seems pointed, and that means that they're upset with me. But it's equally as probable that they're irritated because they have a rock in their shoe. Or maybe they're speaking quickly because their focus is divided between the current conversation and urgent matters that they need to get to. In my experience, a person may blink when lying, or when there's something in their eye, or to shut out visual stimuli like a bright light, or because their eyes were just dry. There's tons of reasons for human behavior, but it would be presumptive to always assume that the person is lying every time I see them blink. That model just doesn't work in most situations. And this is the issue with heuristics, which tend to be overly reliant on confirmation bias. Add on to that how easy it is to misunderstand when a person is not fully invested in the conversation, or when they're tired and their executive functions are dropping. It's easy to lose focus if the other person is being indirect, dropping hints and dancing around their point. And yet, that's how much of the neurotypical population communicates. I spend an inordinate amount of time anticipating how my message will be received because of the feedback that I've received over the years. To one person, I may be too direct. To another, I'm not direct enough. To one person, I'm being terse, and to another, I'm too formal. I once had an experience where a coworker became offended when I asked her a work-related question during work hours because I failed to start the conversation with, "How are you?" This resulted in a 3-hour discussion to try and understand one another. And when it would have been more effective in my mind if she just simply told me that she prefers to start conversations that way. Oh, okay. Then how are you? Why did it take 3 hours for her to tell me that? Was she unclear about what triggered her in the first place? Did she need that extra time to think it through herself? Was I really responsible for the feelings that she experienced in that situation? Would she have treated someone else the same way in the same situation? It's hard to say. In my attempts to understand, it seems as though people forget that their feelings are reactions to stimuli. Nobody made them feel a particular way with their speech. It's simply a natural function of their bodies and minds based on the models that they've built over time. It's baffling to me how someone can unironically say that another person is causing feelings internal to themselves. Sure, you may not always like what someone says, but does that mean that it's said to be intentionally hurtful? No. And studies show that most people are simply communicating in ways that come naturally to them, reserving cognitive energy and relying on natural flow. But if we are constantly applying exclusionary models to everyone, we're going to run into issues. We have to be able to adapt our models or forego them entirely if we want to maintain peace, regardless of communication style. But I know that doing so is easier said than done. Autistics are known to be very literal and direct. In our minds, social dances involve arbitrary steps and phases that aren't relevant to the conversation most of the time. I never really know how much flowery language I need to include, how much I need to bolster a person's ego before they'll be nice, or how much fluff is necessary to pad my message enough for smooth acceptance. I spend tremendous amounts of mental energy trying to tailor my messages to each recipient because I know that is more likely to result in understanding in the long run. However, I find myself being criticized for not following some unspoken rule or for not meeting an expectation that was never communicated before. And not only that, it's met with such a level of resistance that my message will be completely ignored until I've guessed the magic combination of words that meets their demands. I know I've gone on a tangent here, but it's because I know that this is a pain point for so many of us. Sometimes conversations feel like a never-ending guessing game that is not only inefficient, but counterproductive. They can often feel like a weird mental contest where each party is attempting to one-up the other, or that the point is not to have a point, but rather to extend the length of the conversation, or to fill in dead air. But to me, every conversation feels like an obstacle course, full of traps and snares that are designed to turn me into a spectacle. And it can feel like the other person is more concerned about feeling clever at my expense by being as unclear as possible than they are about the conversation itself. And ultimately, the entire charade just feels like a waste of time and energy. And it's a great source of anxiety for me. Autistics are considered to experience deficits in communication. In fact, it's part of the diagnostic criteria. So if neurotypicals are so much better at it, why are autistics expected to adapt beyond our capabilities to match neurotypicals? Isn't communication easier for those in the majority who don't have these deficits, but are inherently capable of proper communication simply through their own instincts? If that's the case, then is it not reasonable to expect them to be most capable at adapting their communication styles for the situation and person they're speaking with? So, knowing this, when communication breaks down, who is responsible for that happening? Is it the person with the deficit or the expert? Who is more likely to take advantage of another person's limitations? Who is more capable of manipulating a conversation to their benefit? And who's more responsible for getting the conversation back on track? Deep breath. I'm losing my zen. The point is, human communication is a complex tapestry woven with words, actions, and emotions. While words provide the foundation, the nuances of communication often lie in the unspoken elements. Research suggests that up to 93% of communication for neurotypicals is nonverbal. That's about 38% for tone of voice and 55% for body language. That leaves the remaining 7% being about their words. In contrast, roughly 25% of autistics are minimally verbal, and the rest of us are heavily reliant on direct communication, which focuses on the actual words being used. We say what we mean and we mean what we say. This gives the impression that we're naive and literal and makes us targets for manipulation. We also experience alexithymia, which is a difficulty in identifying our internal sensations and emotions. And our flat affect, or lack of facial expression, tends to give the impression that we're emotionless. The truth is, we just simply aren't as reliant on nonverbal communication. I will often be unaware of my pace, tone, or pitch until someone points it out. And without people knowing I'm autistic, it's easy for them to presume I'm trying to express something that I'm not. Now, while the diagnostic manual says autistics have a deficit in communication, recent studies show that both neurotypicals and neurodivergent individuals, including verbal autistics, are capable of clear communication within their neurotype and are able to engage in discussions with those of the same neurotype with relatively natural ease. It's when we mix neurotypes that it takes a bit more effort to truly understand the other person. And the responsibility for that should not lie solely on the person with communication deficits. Communication is a two-way street. Either both parties should equally engage in the conversation, putting in equal efforts to understand the other and to avoid misunderstandings, or the neurotypicals who are more capable of adapting to conversations should be more accommodating for those of us who are less capable. But in practice, the neurodivergent person is typically blamed for the breakdown and expected to carry the bulk of the burden to fill the gap. And that's because we are in the minority and expected to conform to the majority. But what happens if you're unaware of your differences or incapable of conforming because of neurological limitations? To many in the majority, that doesn't seem to matter. Unfortunately, humans have a tendency to rely heavily on our senses, believing we saw what we saw, or we felt what we felt and heard what we heard. But if we were right 100% of the time, there wouldn't be such things as magic tricks, optical illusions, mistaken identities, phantom limbs, false positives, or salesmen and politicians. Okay, those last two were a joke, but you get my point. We know that we are imperfect and our senses can deceive us. Therefore, the goals of the conversation should be more about working toward understanding and uncovering the truth. After all, the ability to recognize a pattern is not the same as understanding the truth. One of my favorite games as a child was to identify animals and things and cloud formations and wood grains and random textures. It was a relaxing activity for me and it gave me a lot of pride when I could pick out details that others seemed to overlook. But just because I saw a wolf in a wood grain does not mean there was an actual wolf in the wood. So although we tend to rely a lot on our senses, we can be easily fooled. Witness testimony is notoriously unreliable. That's why there's so many innocent people in jail for crimes that they didn't commit. So while patterns can be observed, they don't necessarily equate to truth. Truth is that which most closely aligns with reality. Our perceptions can be influenced by biases and sensory interpretations, leading to potential misinterpretations that take us further from the truth, not closer to it. Now, neurotypicals benefit from being part of the majority, which tends to reinforce their behaviors through popularity and confirmation bias. And this can make challenging popular opinions difficult because few are willing to admit when they might be wrong. I remember a time when my little sister told me that Grandma told her we didn't come from monkeys, which is true, but a gross oversimplification of evolution. The implication here isn't about evolution, it's about the fact that my sister might be wrong, and if she was, then Grandma was wrong. And that was a reality she wasn't willing to face. Our knowledge is sometimes based on learned experiences from others who we respect. And it can be life-altering to find out that the people we depended on as sources of truth were mistaken themselves. But the avoidance of examining their claims to identify the truth doesn't mean that their claims were all reflective of reality. It's not the popularity of an issue or the convictions of the person holding the belief that makes something true. Truth is that which purports with reality. Take, for example, when people believed the sun revolved around the earth. No matter how many people believed that, it was never true. No matter how strong their convictions, even to the point of killing people who disagreed with them, it was not true. But when you hear someone express themselves confidently and in a way that aligns with your own mental biases, it's easy to see those biases kind of fade away in the background. You feel bolstered knowing there's strength in numbers. Changing opinions in cases like this takes more than someone just simply stating the truth. It also takes a willingness to leave the comfort of the majority and honestly reflect on one's own thought patterns to overcome these biases. Imagine whenever you smelled a hot dog that your body reacted by giving you an instant migraine headache. That was my reality as a child. Now, thankfully, I've outgrown that sensitivity, but to this day, I still do not like hot dogs. But at the time, I was perceived as being too picky, or spoiled, or defiant. And I was forced to ignore my real sensory issues. Then, when I inevitably got sick, I was judged as being overly dramatic, or a lightweight, or weak, or accused of faking it altogether. Autistics literally sense the world differently than neurotypicals. And because of that, the neurotypical models based on the majority's experiences don't often work for us. It's not a matter of lacking focus or attention when your brain is physically incapable of isolating one voice in a crowd of people. It's not a matter of being picky when the food you intake causes an allergic reaction. It's not a matter of fake it till you make it because masking results in minority stress. Mind over matter doesn't work when the matter is your mind. So these models are outdated and useless in so many situations. It would be the height of conceit for me to think that my experiences are everyone else's experiences, and yet that very level of projection is heaped upon the neurodivergent community all day, every day. I once had a manager who was convinced that I was a mean person. So she assigned me to write a threatening email to leadership to get them to respond to us. She was surprised when I couldn't do it, but pleasantly relieved when my diplomatic email worked just as well. But those who actually got to know me know that I'm not a mean person. But my manager did not have time to get to know me, so she relied on her heuristics, which helped her to make a quick decision. Unfortunately for me, when she sensed different tones and patterns in my speech, they aligned with a model of someone from her past that was mean. And that may have kept her safe for the majority of her life, but it was still an overgeneralization. This confirmation bias is a major downside to heuristics because it overgeneralizes and often ignores important details. Despite me telling her that I suffered from generalized anxiety disorder, which is common in a lot of neurodivergents, and that I was not upset, just scared. She struggled to let go of her biased models and expected me to conform to her idea of a good employee without ever explaining what that model looked like. And time and again, I found myself having to defend myself against her reactions to me based on models that I never fit in the first place. And this happens a lot due to our over-reliance on nonverbal cues, especially during the pandemic, when most of us in my company, my prior employer, were working remotely. We lost the ability to communicate using body language to a degree unless we were on video. and this led to a lot of misunderstandings. However, nonverbal communication, which is heavily reliant on our senses, can also be easily misinterpreted depending on the parties involved, and depending on cultural differences and individual variations in sensory perception. Those things can complicate our interpretations of nonverbal cues. And that poses a significant challenge in cross-cultural communication and interactions between neurotypical and autistic individuals, because we literally sense the world differently. We do not rely on the same models. But instead of this being enough to convince my leadership that they may need to rethink their models, they would cling to their heuristics and double down on punishments that were never deserved in the first place. Instead of being honest and looking past the surface, they chose to remain confident that their emotions were accurate reflections of external stimuli, and what they were witnessing was being accurately interpreted by their senses based on their preconceived models. But no matter how much they wanted to believe it, they could not, and still can't, read my mind. They were assumptions that led them to faulty conclusions that damaged my reputation and social standing every time, no exceptions. I was constantly subjected to accusations about my intentions, something they couldn't possibly know without me sharing my intentions. But that didn't stop them from building a model of me and twisting me as the villain in their story that was deserving of the punishment that was directed at me. And these biases became worse and worse until they ultimately ended my career. This is a very real and common issue for the neurodivergent community. Biases often hinder our ability to assess reality accurately. And overconfidence in our perceptions can lead to projecting our experiences and ideas onto others, ignoring their individuality. While we share similarities as humans, each person, especially within the autistic community, is unique. The most honest way to communicate involves checking our assumptions, sticking to the facts, avoiding stereotypes, and asking clarifying questions that lead to a better understanding. But that just wasn't part of the culture that had been cultivated by my former employer. Human communication is a complex interplay of verbal and nonverbal elements. Understanding the nuances of nonverbal communication, considering cultural differences, and recognizing the individuality of others is essential for effective and honest communication with the majority. By cultivating empathy and actively seeking to understand different perspectives, we can bridge the communication gaps with the minority and foster more meaningful connections. But we need to challenge the idea that the minority is responsible for picking up the slack when communication reaches an impasse. Communication is a two-way street, and that requires both sides to make an effort to understand. If you have to make assumptions, then assume positive intent. Give people the benefit of the doubt. And take responsibility for your own role when communication starts to break down. Because shutting down and laying the entire burden fully in someone else's lap is the opposite of communication. We need to remember that our own experiences are not the experiences of everyone. We need to be cognizant of differences and compassionate to those who struggle to meet social demands. Be slow to blame others for your emotional reactions to something that they said. Stop trying to read minds, because you're only fooling yourself and hurting others when you do. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, consider subscribing.